record here. Okay, perfect. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much to all of the panelists that we have for joining us and sharing their knowledge and experience with us. So before we get started, I want to let you all know the format of today's event. We're going to have about 45 minutes to an hour of a panel. So I'm going to ask the panelists questions and they'll respond as they see fit. And then afterward, we're going to have about 45 minutes of breakout rooms. So you'll be able to join the employers, join the professionals in their breakout rooms and ask any directed questions that you may have. You can definitely ask questions during the panel portion of the event. So feel free to share them in the chat or message Gabe with any questions that you have during the panel portion. Okay, so for the breakout rooms, we're going to have about 45 minutes. So I would suggest, going to all of the different breakout rooms, you'll have time to go to about 3 if you spend 15 minutes in each room. Definitely consider if one room is super packed, switch to another room and then go and revisit that other room afterward. And you'll get like a message saying it's been 15 minutes, please consider switching rooms. And if you have any technical issues, please feel free to chat Gabe in the Zoom. All right, with that covered, we are going to introduce our panelists. So we're just going to go in order of this slide. So Jose.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I do at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Why is our name that? Well, Friends are short for the Religious Society of Friends, otherwise known as Quakers, and that's who I represent in the halls of Congress and occasionally the administration. My scope of work involves just reform, which is essentially mitigating harm, so trying to reduce criminal sentences, improving prison conditions and services, as well as trying to implement police reform to make police more accountable and less violent. Also within my portfolio is democracy reform. So I work on elections issues to make elections more fair, equitable, and accessible. And I've been with FCNL, or sometimes I call them the Quakers, since 2016.
Thank you so much. John?
Thank you. Good afternoon / evening to everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to be present in this event. I'm Dr. John Hart. I'm an Associate Director of Partnerships and Community Networking for the Restoring Promise Initiative at the Vera Institute of Justice. The Vera Institute of Justice is a top-notch nonprofit organization that is powered by hundreds of advocates, researchers, activists working to transform the criminal, legal, and immigration system until there is equity for all folks. The initiative I specifically work on is called Restoring Promise, and it's an initiative that is partnered with Vera and also California-based Chicano indigenous organization called MILPA. And our initiative focuses on creating alternative housing for young adults who are serving time in prison and creating housing units that are grounded in human dignity. And so what we do specifically is we work with prisons across the country to replace the punishing correctional culture that's rooted in aspects of racism and white supremacy. And we try to instill new community, creating new communities in the prisons, especially for young adults with values such as cultural healing, race equity, restorative justice, and family and family community partnership. And we work very closely to creating these units and making change for these young adults who are incarcerated. We work very closely with those who are incarcerated, the young folks and the line staff. So that's our ability to just give voice to the people who tend to be left from the table of change and policy modification. So again, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I apologize, Candace, your title did not update. She is a sociology PhD student, but if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. No worries at all. So my name is Candace Crutchfield, and I use she, her pronouns. And thank you, Erin, for inviting me to be here with you all this afternoon. I will just briefly say that I definitely feel like I've worn a lot of hats in the field of the criminal justice world, or as I kind of refer to it as the criminal punishment system. But I think my two main hats are working in the nonprofit realm, as well as, of course, the academic sector as a PhD student here at Ohio State University. Interestingly enough, prior to becoming an Ohio State student back in August, I actually worked full-time at the Vera Institute of Justice with colleague John Hart. I was actually on the jail decarceration team, where we worked with communities to reduce their jail incarceration rates. And we worked on a number of projects that kind of centered the experiences of women in jails and uplifting their narratives. But back in August, I did actually decide to go back to graduate school, enrolling in a PhD program at Ohio State. I was doing both my PhD coursework here in Ohio, but also working remotely for Vera up until about a month ago. I left my position at Vera so I could have the right amount of time and space to concentrate on the academic side of things. So I definitely have an interesting pathway of a career both in and outside of academia. So I'm happy to talk more in depth about that as we go throughout our panel today. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much, Candace. Taylor?
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor King. I am a research and program associate on the Justice Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. I have been at Brennan for about 2 years now. The Brennan Center broadly focuses on 3 main issue areas: democracy reform, justice reform, and then liberty and national security. I specifically, as my title would indicate, am on the Justice Program. The vast majority of my work is research support for our various publications. I'd say my 3 areas of expertise would be private community supervision, so things like private probation, electronic monitoring, looking into kind of the perverse incentives associated with that. Federal judicial oversight of prisons and jails, so things like the Hinds County case that's going on right now, looking into potentially putting a particularly egregious jail system into a receivership, which is appointing a federal monitor to kind of have unilateral power to reform it, and looking at how that could maybe be scaled to Rikers. And then I also do a lot of work looking specifically at non-carceral responses to violence. So I have about, prior to joining the Brennan Center, 12 years of experience in the gun violence prevention movement, where I did a lot of kind of restorative justice type work. I'm also just a few years out from undergrad. I graduated in 2020, and I'll be going to law school this upcoming fall semester. So if anyone has any questions, as someone who's pretty fresh out of undergrad and kind of still in that process, I am happy to be a resource there as well.
Thank you so much. And Kimberly?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Great to be here. My name is Kimberly Crawford. I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator with the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and DCC-ADV is the federally recognized coalition of domestic violence programs in the district, as well as organizations and individuals that are generally focused and organized towards the elimination of domestic violence in the district. And so in my role in the Training and Outreach Coordinator position, I focus on training advocates as well as other allied professionals that could be medical professionals, mental health, legal, and law enforcement as well. And I try to take a trauma-informed approach in training that really encompasses the understanding of the complex traumas that being a victim of crime can have on an individual, and to also practice cultural competency when working in the criminal justice system. And so a lot of my work focuses on prevention as well as coping and recovery with victims of crime. And kind of piggybacking off of Taylor, I am also a 2020 graduate from the University of Maryland. And I am currently pursuing a master's degree in conjunction with working full-time. So if anyone has any questions about how I balance those things and about my experience as a new grad in this field, I'm open to answering any of those.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for introducing yourself. So we can get started on this panel here. So please feel free to answer as you see fit here. So my first question is, what does criminal justice reform mean to you, and why are you passionate about criminal justice reform? And anyone can answer.
I can go first. I'm a son of immigrants born and raised in New York City. And I know that I had really close friends growing up in New York that went to jail and went to prison. They sold drugs. I had a good friend in high school who sold drugs to make extra money. And we also know that the criminal legal system really heavily prioritizes enforcement against people who look just like me. So when you add these things together, you have these confluence of factors that ruin communities, ruin people's lives, don't look at the root causes of how people get where they get, and seeks to correct it by throwing them in a cage. And going back to my original point, I work in the faith community, so I really appreciate this one quote that says, there but for the grace of God go I. And this could have been me. I could have gone to prison. I could have gone to jail. This could have happened to me. It happened to my friends. And it happens every year to people who look like me. And I'm really passionate about stopping that from happening and mitigating harm and trying to focus on more restorative aspects to correcting behavior and improving people's lives as opposed to ruining them.
You know, I think, thank you for sharing that, Jose. And I think I can also jump in with, I guess, my pathway and my interests in this field. So, you know, I think reform here is an interesting word. And I say this as someone who has been reading and following the work of folks like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and others who have spent their lives, you know, dedicated to thinking and talking about systems and imagining better alternatives and visions for what we see today. So I think for me, this idea of reform is kind of more broad. I see it as an opportunity to re-envision our conception of justice, and I put justice in quotes. And I think about that, whether that be how we hold each other accountable for the things that other people may do, or how our systems may respond to those activities. And speaking as someone, I didn't mention this in the introduction, but I have a criminology background. I'm obviously a sociology PhD student now, but I consider myself a scholar of incarceration, specifically prisons. And I come to this as a person, as a Black person, as a Black woman, if we want to get more specific, who from a very early age, you know, saw how incarceration of a family member impacted not just our greater family, but the community at large. So having this account, this direct account of what a system of punishment can do, being in this line of work as an academic or as a former non-academic career too, it provides me with this space to kind of use my resources. And I feel as though you probably would feel the same way. I was using our resources to kind of enact change, and particularly enact the change that impacts the people who are, you know, disproportionately impacted by, like Jose said, policing, courts, and other systems of punishment. And then also just a small tidbit, I especially think about the time period that we're in right now, thinking about 2020 and what we witnessed. I mean, if you weren't with us before, how can you watch that happen and not be passionate about issues of, if we want to call it reform, accountability, or the broad spectrum of the system? So I think when I think of reform or this line of work and what this means to me, that's what I think of.
I absolutely agree with both Candace and Jose, and I echo that as definitely a motivation for me to be in this field as a first generation immigrant myself. And I also think that what Candace mentioned about the idea of reform, right? So as a trainer myself and someone who educates, advocates on how to work within the system with diverse populations, particularly marginalized populations, not only racially and ethnically, but also bisexual orientation as well. It's very easy for us to get wrapped up in the idea of restorative and rehabilitative justice, and the idea that if we create programs that do these things and that are claiming to be trauma informed, that is enough to reform the system. And it's really not. Because when we think about reform, we have to think about it foundationally. And we have to think that the system itself was not built on those ideals that those programs are functioning on. So the system does not allow room for those reform programs to prosper and for them to work. And so I think there's a lot of different points of entry into this idea of reform, right? And there's very little focus on that primary prevention component and that primary policy, I guess, area of how we reform the system, right? We try to reform things after they've already happened, after people have already been involved in the system or they've already been a victim of crime. And by that point, it's too late, right? And so I think that for me is what reform means and what criminal justice reform needs to be. It needs to be a reimagination of the foundational ideas of why we have this system and what the system is really meant to do.
Piggybacking off of what Kimberly said, so I came into justice reform. Specifically, I grew up in Oklahoma, which for a large portion of my upbringing was the state with the highest incarceration rate in the world. And to this day, it still has the highest incarceration rate of women identifying people. So growing up with that perspective was very interesting. And then additionally, I am a survivor of sexual violence and gun violence. Someone very close to me was shot and killed when I was very young. And kind of seeing the process unfold from that side as someone who had been through a certain amount of trauma at a very young age and seeing kind of the criminal legal system operate, you'd see, a person who had done something go to prison, but ultimately the resources were not there to support the people who had been impacted. And you begin, as you age and do research to see how these things are cyclical. People who have been impacted by trauma and violence, it impacts your development and it impacts the way you view the world. And if I had not had the resources that I had growing up, I think my experiences would have been very different. So to me, justice looks a lot like everyone has been saying, kind of redefining our understanding of justice, but also approaching things from a different angle. So not just the reactive types of responses that we've been doing, going in for legitimately proactive preventative measures, addressing the systemic inequality that has perpetuated violence, incarceration, and all of the different levels of inequality and inequity in this country. So justice reform to me is not something that you can just do specifically focused on justice. And that was something that I did a lot in my violence prevention work as well, talking about how education policy, healthcare policy, things like that, economic equity are all violence prevention measures and crime prevention measures. Just a fun little aside, I know someone who is a music theory master's student who is working on developing public artworks to mitigate noise pollution because she sees that noise pollution impacts brain development and can perpetuate violence in different communities and things like that. So there's a million different ways to get involved. And my perspective on justice is a very multidisciplinary communal approach to building pro-social bonds, developing communities, and righting historic wrongs.
Yeah, I appreciate everything my fellow panelists have said. I also appreciate the level of vulnerability and just kind of transparency. I think that's what's always needed in the work of reform, criminal justice reform. And so I appreciate you folks. For myself, kind of like some of the folks have said, I am a second generation African immigrant, and growing up in a dual context here in this country, and also trying to manage the spheres of growing up at home. There's some level of distance the criminal legal system has on folks who are not born here or whose family members are not born here. And I saw it up real close and personal. And that was one of the biggest things that stood out to me about when you think about the criminal justice system, when you have people who look like each other, but their experiences relating to the system is quite different. But also on a professional level, I think when I got to grad school, as I put in the chat, I went to University of Maryland and I was in the School of Public Health. I was able to get a clinical degree, and I started working with families and couples that were on the lower end of the socioeconomic status. And one of the most prominent things, and I even noticed this as a researcher when I got into the PhD program as well, was that when you talk about equity, it's scary that Black and brown teenagers and young adults, one of the most prominent institutions they engage with are prisons. And that, what I was able to do when I was in grad school was argue that that was a public health concern. So we talk about public health a lot. We say like, oh, there's high blood pressure, there is diabetes. And I was able to say like, well, when you think about the level of disparity that exists for a prominent institution like the criminal justice system to be a part of certain groups, that is a public health concern. And so when you think about mass incarceration, when you think about some of these other kind of processes that perpetuate the foolishness that we're in and how it's harming a lot of communities of color and other marginalized places. When I think about reform, I'm always thinking about, well, what are the values tied to the efforts? At the Vera Institute of Justice, we talk about values all the time. When you look at the initiatives at the Vera Institute of Justice, we're always talking about values. So what values do people have when they enter the work? You have to be able to think about it, because the humanistic part of that work is motivating, and we have to kind of stay grounded around that. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there, because the work is one thing, but if the work can be motivated through values, I think that's another kind of effort and energy that's continuously going to be needed moving forward.
Thank you all so much for sharing. The next question that I have is, what impact or change did you see in your industry after George Floyd's murder, particularly in policy and public support?
So working in the realm of victim advocacy, especially in domestic violence, where a lot of protections that are in place for survivors of domestic violence require them to cooperate with law enforcement, there has definitely been a significant challenge in, I guess, the public support of movements that have arisen from the murder of George Floyd. And a lot of that is because there's a lot of interconnecting parts of this field, right? It's very there's a lot of intersectionality. And so because of that, as an organization, it's difficult to speak up on a lot of things, even though you might agree with them, because they can send a wrong message to a lot of allied partners. And specifically, one thing that has come up is the support for community-based violence intervention programs, particularly one in the district with violence interrupters. And that being kind of a rising trend that's occurring now across the nation. And the support for those community-based organization, law enforcement alternatives, is high, and it's great, but it also can potentially send the wrong message to law enforcement and make it seem as though, people are saying that law enforcement is not needed, or law enforcement is not reliable, or things of that nature. And so for that reason, there is a lot of political tension that has arisen because of that. And it really takes away from the emphasis that needs to be put on victim services and victim advocacy, because they are the ones that are suffering from all of the disagreement and all of the conflated opinions around a lot of these issues, right? And so a lot of that has been definitely coming up in a lot of the trainings that I've been doing, and a lot of the conversations that are being had when it comes to funding allocations, and tackling this idea of primary prevention, and how to get that message across that these things are important, and they are just as important as relying on the system, because there are other ways that we can help helping primary prevention efforts is helping the system, right? Because there's time and time again where we've seen where the system is overcrowded and the system is, has too much on its plate. But in these conversations, there's a lot of tension that can arise from that, unfortunately.
I would also say that while the outrage and the community organizing after the murder of George Floyd is absolutely justified, I think a lot of it has been perverted by our nation's fundamentally broken understanding of justice. So a number of people, look at the case and say, oh, but they arrested the officers, justice is served, he's going to prison, when ultimately a definition of justice that relies on punishment is a fundamentally flawed definition of justice. Justice should be restorative. It should be working to right whatever wrongs have been committed in whatever way you possibly can. And obviously murder is not a wrong you can entirely right, but looking into the systems that have allowed something like this to happen and taking the steps necessary to support those who have been impacted is, I feel, a more accurate perception of justice. And I just think that the way we view justice and punishment in this country has hindered the true impact that this political moment could have had. And I'm also just loath to say that a murder is in any way something that could be good. People say, oh, but this was the spark that ignited the flame. But ultimately, if we want to be entirely honest, it was a person being murdered. And I think people get so caught up in the allure of movement building that they forget about the humanity of the people involved. And I think it's really easy to look at statistics and forget that the statistics each relate to an individual person and an individual story. So there's a lot of dehumanization and kind of perverted understandings of justice at play that we have to contend with, which is a very dark and negative take. And I apologize for being such a bummer, but it is, well, unfortunately, the truth.
Yeah, I don't think, Taylor, I stand with you in solidarity with, some of the comments that you made. And part of what I was thinking, when Aaron had posed the question was some of the stuff that I've been seeing at Vera and like other organizations is really trying to improve the role, the noticeability that community can have in a lot of these processes, right? So historically, communities, especially Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, are always marginalized from aspects of life. One of them being, what does law and order look like, and what does justice looks like? And if these folks aren't at the table, then the things imposed upon them, the murder of George Floyd can and will happen. I mean, that's just like a historical, kind of fact. And so that's one of the things that is always important, is like, how can we push the role that community can have in these processes? What does it take? And I think why that is not always at the forefront is that because what's underneath that are some of the brutal aspects of being in America, like racism, and because like you would have to confront that. You would have to ask why are some communities more involved in shaping policy and maneuvering the criminal justice system and all that. But to do that, you would have to have an honest conversation and start highlighting some of the structural inequalities that have been imposed. And to do that takes a lot of bravery. And so the role of community is important. I also agree with Taylor that when you think about a life being lost and in this, it's not just George Floyd. There are people well before George Floyd. And the sad and scary thing about it is we continue to lose people, and yet over time it slowly goes back to kind of like the same thing. And so for people who are disproportionately impacted by these experiences with police or other kind of entities in the community, why, again, I'm just going to push this again, like why aren't they at the forefront of leading what change is? And organizations can start doing a better job of empowering and equipping and mobilizing. And it doesn't have to just be money. And I think sometimes that gets really caught up in the nonprofit world, that it's just giving money, and it's no, how can we improve the political stature and the resources, you know, to allow there to be like a stronghold on people owning their own community. And so, you know, where restorative justice, like Jose and Taylor and other folks have brought up, can be more prominent. But again, in order to get there, you'd have to start confronting, you know, racism and all the other things, all of the disproportionate experiences some of these people are having. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for answering that. Gabe, I think we had a student question if you wanted to read that.
Yep, we had a question from Dash in the chat. There are currently so many people incarcerated in this country who should not be there for various reasons. And there's most certainly will be many people incarcerated who should not be there in the future. Taking the very specific and not all-encompassing objective of reducing these numbers, what area of work, whether it be electoral, advocacy, research, legal services, public opinion, or something else, do you believe can be the most effective in bringing or keeping people home? They said that I know it's more complicated than that, and they are definitely all important, but very interested in hearing your thoughts. And for some additional context, they added that they've been trying to bring home someone who was been wrongly incarcerated for 34 years in Maryland State Prison, and frustrated with certain tactics that they've been using, feel like they're spinning their wheels.
Thanks, Dash, for asking that question. And I don't have a fully detailed answer, but I think it might be something to get the conversation rolling. I see, what is it, whether it be electoral advocacy, research, legal services, public opinion. I'm obviously speaking from the academic and the research side, but I would argue that the work that I produce does not do much without someone like John Hart at Vera or someone at the Brennan Center, beyond and so forth, without them taking that research and then, you know, taking it to someone else. I would say that all of the aspects that you listed here, whether it be electoral or an advocate or even legal services, you know, they all have different connections. And I mean, all of us on this panel have different connections, and I'm sure that I might know someone who Jose doesn't know, or Jose might know someone who Taylor doesn't know. So I think working in tandem, and not necessarily one being the be all end all or one being the sole solution, I think working in tandem is how we get that change and that movement going. So that's just something that popped up at the top of my head as the question was read aloud.
Yeah, piggybacking on what Candace shared, not what you want to hear, but all of the above. You just seen it all. I remember when I first started at FCNL, I was working on a first in a generation kind of bill to really tackle the criminal legal system and both reduce sentences and also improve conditions and services in prisons. I very frequently used papers and statistics, well, mainly statistics and facts that the Sentencing Project produced. They do research, so I use that. I was coming at it after a good, solid, strong effort by the faith community that essentially blanketed Iowa. Chuck Grassley couldn't sneeze without finding somebody of faith, talking to him about the criminal legal system. That was electoral, that was retail politics. And the bill unfortunately failed, but it gave rise to the First Step Act, which eventually passed in 2018, thanks to Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who was then the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who added sentencing reform, which without, you don't really have a good bill, because if you're not limiting the harm and stopping people from going into prison, how much of a bill is it? So all of those things came together. And from that point, you started seeing
Did he cut out for everyone? Okay, we'll give it 1 second here.
While Jose is paused, I can like maybe talk just to
Sure.
keep rolling.
Great.
Yeah. So I'll say
Baby bills be introduced.
Oh no.
Oh,
Okay. Oh,
Jose, you're back.
Sorry about that. I thought the new modem would have fixed that, but I guess not.
sorry. You cut out as you were saying.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure when I started to cut out, but basically I said that the First Step Act was then proposed in 2018, thanks to Chairman Chuck Grassley, who we advocated with in a retail politics style of organizing that passed, that was then taken up by state legislatures across the country that proposed their own state level First Step Acts. So, I mean, this system is so broad and broken and exists at so many different levels that you need an all of the above approach to really address it. And the key is, where do you most see you fitting in to advocate and to dismantle at that system of mass incarceration?
And then just going beyond that, I completely understand the frustration of feeling like you're working towards something so important, but it's just, you're just spinning your wheels, going on and on and on. I had been doing, violence prevention, community organizing work for a decade, and it felt like, one step forward, 700 steps back, and nothing could ever get done. And as unfortunate as it sounds, just with the way that our court systems are set up and our political system is the path it's going down, unfortunately, a lot of times what you have to do to make a change is just keep spinning your wheels until you eventually get traction. Chip away, and like bit by bit, every time you hit it, a little bit falls off and a little bit falls off. As much as, I'm a complete idealist, as much as I would like to just wave a wand and like have all of the problems solved, that's just not the way our system works, unfortunately. So sometimes you have to do things that feel like banging your head against a wall, just trying to get a little bit of movement. And it's demoralizing, and it can be disillusioning, and it can really, really frustrate you sometimes. But ultimately, you just have to keep spinning your wheels until you start to move again.
Absolutely. I agree with everyone's thoughts on this. I think it is definitely an all of the above approach. And I think that working in a field like this, where it does feel like there's a one step forward and 700 steps backward, it really pushes you and motivates you, at least for me, to use your voice in whatever capacity that you can, right? So it doesn't matter what your specialty is, what your expertise is, it matters what you do with that expertise. And so for me, I have a background in psychology and criminal justice. I focus on trauma. And so I use that and I push it to help advocates understand how they work with their clients in an entirely different perspective, outside of giving them the resources and this number for legal aid and all of these things, right? Because the truth of the matter is, a lot of victims, especially of gender-based violence, are never going to report what they've experienced. So a resource about legal aid or a similar resource is not going to help them, right? So we have to approach things very differently. And when we approach things from that different standpoint, we need to use our voice to say why it's important to do that, right? So that can be submitting testimony to bill hearings. That can be testifying at performance oversight hearings for government agencies, and making your voice heard to argue something, because the chances are that you're not the only one who thinks that way. And so all you need to do is plant the seed that's gonna, grow into something more. And when other people, you ever heard of that thing where no one wants to participate in class until someone else says something first, and then they start talking? That's all it needs to happen, right? It's a snowball effect. And so whatever specialty you choose, just know that you will have the support of a lot of other allied professionals in order to get the job done. And that's, I think, what makes criminal justice reform in this field so great, and why I love it so much, because I work with a lot of different people all the time. And every time I have a conversation, there's something new that is being brought up. There's a new perspective. And that's extremely valuable when you're trying to change an entire system.
And I would just quickly hop in and just piggyback off of Kimberly's point. I really appreciated that. And I think I just add that, it's okay to try something out and figure out what your strengths are and what you really feel most effective doing and what you really enjoy. I know I said it in my introduction, but I was also a researcher at the Bureau Institute of Justice. I loved my time there. I thought that was a great experience, but I knew that, I was a little bit happier doing academic lines of work and doing research that was more connected to an academic institution. So of course it hurt a little bit to leave one job, but I ended up being able to, enroll in a university and get back into something that's a little bit closer to the work that I felt most effective doing. And that's like teaching others about the punishment system and being able to have that effect on individuals and how work with how they're thinking about the punishment system in a classroom setting, as opposed to more direct contact at the Bureau Institute of Justice. So just echoing everything that the panelists have said, but also just reiterating that it's okay to try things out, leave, and you can also always come back to things as well.
Thank you. All right, my next question is, what are some of the skills and core competencies that are necessary for your career, and how can undergraduate students gain some experience in this field, whether that be through internships, volunteering, maybe entry-level jobs, etc.?
This is a really good question. We get this all the time, and I think some of the folks who, from Candace and Taylor, who either worked at Vera or know folks who worked at Vera, I'll be strictly honest. I mean, like, Vera is a quite competitive place to get in. We joke that it's quite the exclusive club, and the demand that they have, even at entry levels, are quite high. And one of the things that I'll share is that I don't think it's as kind of clear cut as it was probably like, 10, 15 years ago, where it's like, you just need a degree in this, you need a degree in that. I do think Vera has come a long way, in which there is a lot of other skills that are quite helpful, right? So like, there's the technical aspect, right? Like, from being a researcher to, things that are more underlying, like a program associate, like project management, like there are things that are there. There's also aspects of personal lifestyle things that I think are critical to the criminal legal system now. So being in tune with ideas of like restorative justice and trainings. I mean, like, those things now are kind of where a place like Vera is at now. Like, while they are really big on a lot of the technical stuff, so if you're a researcher, great. If you have any other kind of like training, from research to operations to fundraising, I mean, like, there's a lot, and everything kind of plays a role. It's not just at Vera. I think at any particular institute, I would be remiss not to admit that that's how it is everywhere else. So everyone can play a role, but I do think there's a lot more, I think there's more of a demand of like who people are, what they're bringing. Again, I'm stressing like the values. I've noticed that some of the interviews that are being had at Vera are asking people like, what are some values or what is some of your lived experience? Are you a system impacted person? Do you know? I mean, these questions are coming up, folks, just as much as, do you know how to do regressions as a researcher, or have you ever led a program in the community? Because what's happening is, and I'll be honest and frank, is that in order to continue to battle the monster of mass incarceration, we need more people who are far more in alignment in terms of like their values around the work, the commitment, than it is like their actual, what they got the degree in, and what their technical skills are around. Because I'll be honest, like, there are people who like show up to work, do really great job, and then like walk away at the close of business and not be truly in alignment with what the work is about. I got to call that out. I've seen it, and I just think where we are as societies, especially if you're working for a nonprofit or whatever, I think folks really need to put some thought and effort, not just showing up in interviews, putting a whole list together of like all the great things you did in grad school or undergrad, but also taking time to really reflect. And I'll be honest, it's not just quoting things from books, naming top authors. You got to really be about like showing up and highlighting what are aspects of your lived experience you can bring into this. Because I think the work is that complex, and we need more people who are in alignment, I think, with a lot of the values to undermine this beast known as mass incarceration, the criminal legal system. So I just wanted to kind of come at that question from a different aspect, and I hope that's all right.
And that's something that I say to people who reach out to me on LinkedIn, and students who reach out and ask how I got into this position in this kind of field all the time is, just like Vera, Brennan is not an easy place to get a job. I tell people frequently I applied to 3 internships at Brennan, and I got rejected to 3 internships at Brennan before getting this job. And ultimately what it came down to, and I think the reason that I was able to get the position I have right now, is because I, like John said, reflected on what I was bringing to the table, the significance of the non-carceral violence prevention work that I've been doing, and how that contributes to the broader movement. And another thing you need to think about before you come into this, like John was saying, is you have to be the job. When I leave work, I am still keeping my eyes peeled. I live in a community in New York where there is a very high police presence. And if I see the police talking to someone, I stop. I'm not going to keep walking. I'm going to be someone who is holding, the systems of power in my community accountable. It's not something that you check at the door. You have to be very committed to it at all times. You have to be ready to call people out when the situation comes up. But there really is no true core competency that I think you need to have at this point. You just need to be passionate, willing to put in the work, and willing to really dedicate yourself to this. But additionally, I'm sure it is very discouraging to hear both me and John talking about how hard it is to get jobs at the places we work. And I want to encourage you all, the majority of my internships that I had before this job were not at places like Vera or Brennan or anything like that. It is, as important as the work that we are doing is, the work on the ground in, smaller organizations, in individual communities, is just as important. So don't limit yourself to looking at, oh, I have to get a job at the Brennan Center, I have to get a job at Friends or Vera or, domestic violence organizations, things like that. Like, that is not the only option available to you. We're trying to look into like some Southern outreach work at Brennan right now. And I've been looking into a number of organizations that work specifically in cities or states around the country and are doing extremely important work. And doing that work with smaller organizations is just as impactful. And I mean, honestly, working at Brennan has been an amazing experience. And like Candace said, like, I'm heartbroken to be leaving. But ultimately, I have found that my passion lies in doing direct service work on the ground in my home community in Tulsa. That is the work I want to do. And as much as I've enjoyed the policy side of things, I don't necessarily know if I'll go back to it, maybe years and years down the line. But don't limit yourself to, the huge name or the city you want to be in. Look into the work that is being done by other organizations and realize that your contributions might even be felt on a larger scale in a smaller organization than they would be when you are just one of however many employees at a larger organization.
So this isn't going to look great because I'm going to go against what both John and Taylor said, but I'm going to give more general advice because, to be perfectly frank, I didn't understand this beast of mass incarceration. It's not something that I knew that I saw, even though I grew up in New York City in the 80s and 90s. It was right there. I didn't really see it. I really was focused on foreign policy, and that's where I thought my calling was. But I did see poverty. I knew poverty. My grandmother was an economic migrant, and I know that well in my heart and soul. I didn't know that's I think the root cause of the criminal justice system, of mass incarceration, poverty, people trying to get by, people trying to do better. And although I didn't do a lot of internships, I have varied experience that led me to the position that I have now, that with that life experience, I can understand where people come from that are justice involved. And what I would say to you all is, I encourage you to take advantage of as many internships and as many opportunities, reach out to people, because in doing that, you get to know what they do. You get to do what is needed in this fight to dismantle mass incarceration, and then you can take that experience into the interview and bring both your values and also what you've done to get a start. Because sometimes getting a start is really difficult. I started off as a social worker, and now I'm a lobbyist in the faith community. I have a really non-traditional path. So in being able to walk the walk, you have to know what you bring to the table, what you're good at, and it really helps to know a little bit about it. And it's tough to do it if you don't talk to people who've been doing it, and if you haven't taken a position or two doing that work. So you have to bring all these things to bear to make yourself a really strong candidate. Because again, I mean, I lobby on justice reform, but it's not something that I studied or I started doing. I got here based off of my understanding of congressional procedure. I got here based off of my understanding of how these systems keep people of color down in all aspects and all ways. I got there from my understanding of poverty. So I brought all these things to bear into the position that I have now, and that's how I got to. I'm also a pretty tough organization to work for, but we do have a lot of program assistant positions, and I encourage you to apply.
Thank you so much. Did anyone else want to hop in? Perfect. Okay, so I do want to make sure that we leave time for students to ask y'all some directed questions. So Gabe, if you can create the breakout rooms, students can join. It looks like we've got about 35 minutes. So I'll let you know every like 12 minutes or so, and you can rotate rooms if you would like. All right. So please feel free to join these rooms.